The church is realistic that the constitutional and other legal guarantees of religion are not always successful because of the way the church has been treated. I grew up in my own family knowing some of that realism. At the same time, as we live in the current time and as we look forward to the future, the free exercise of religion is fundamental to our existence, and it is a companion to our religious doctrine. When I say that I have had some experience with the excesses of government action against people who should have been protected by the free exercise of religion, I am mindful of the following in my history. My great-grandfather, Harris, from whom I get my middle name, was imprisoned in the Utah State Penitentiary for his practice of plural marriage, which was fundamental to his doctrine at that time. His daughter, my great-aunt, was imprisoned in the penitentiary as one of the few women who were imprisoned for plural marriage. And she took with her a baby, whom I knew as a grown-up medical doctor in my earlier years. My great-great-grandmother died on the plains of Iowa when the Mormons were forcibly expelled from Nauvoo. And my wife's great-great-great-grandfather, Hiram Smith, the brother of Joseph Smith, was murdered by an anti-Mormon mob in Carthage, Illinois. So I don't have to look very far in my own ancestry and personal acquaintances to have evidence of the importance of free exercise of religion. The history of that event I wrote a book about. It's called Carthage Conspiracy, and it tells the story of the trial of 9 men indicted for the murder of Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. And they were acquitted by the jury. And to make a long story short, the argument of the defense was for jury nullification, which is a modern term we've heard about in connection with civil rights murders in the South. But basically, the defense counsel said these people are not guilty of murder because they did what you wanted them to do in killing these leaders of the obnoxious Mormons, and therefore you can't find them guilty of murder. That's the same argument that was made in the South when some civil rights proponents were murdered by local people, and the federal government couldn't get convictions because the jury approved of what had been done. Personally, free exercise guarantees me the right to exercise my religious faith. That means to live by the principles of my religion, whether other people approve of them or not, and to be part of an educational enterprise, a university or a school that teaches things that people don't approve of for religious reasons, and to go forward with my life and the choices that I make in my personal life according to the principles I've been taught in my religion. The word exercise is very important. The word exercise means that I can act according to my conscience, that I can carry out activities and actions that affect others, that are visible to others. And it has limits, of course, because in a pluralistic society, some of my actions could impinge on the welfare, even the life or well-being of those around me. So the free exercise of religion has to be confined by the authority of the government to look after the overall health, welfare, and well-being of the rest of society. That principle has been applied, even in our own day, for people who will pass laws against such religious conduct because it offends them. Mm-hmm. And we've seen a lot of litigation, some of it criminal, some of it civil, that tests the limits of government to forbid religious-based exercise because it is offensive or inconvenient or objectionable to other people who don't share that belief. And that's an ongoing result of the fact that the free exercise of religion is subject to limits. How you apply the principle that government can make some restrictions on religious free exercise is an ongoing issue that is of concern to lawmakers and to judges. It has changed significantly, and I think the major cause of change is the expanding role of government. Because as citizens look to government to do more and more for their well-being, which is the trend of the last century, as government gets into more and more activities, the scope of its concern and the exercise of its regulatory power expands, and so there's a greater overlap with the free exercise of religion. And that's been a major force during my lifetime. And the other way it has changed is that new rights are expected or formulated by people because of the ongoing cultural development of the country. For example, non-discrimination. You wouldn't read much about non-discrimination in the newspapers or the laws even 75 years ago. Now it's a very big issue, and it comes up against religious freedom. That has occurred more frequently in the last 75 years because of the expanding role of government. The Mormons in Nauvoo had just been expelled from Missouri, whose governor signed an extermination order and sent it to the militia and said, drive out these obnoxious Mormons, and if they can't be driven out, you're authorized to exterminate them. Now, the people in Nauvoo had been through that, including my own ancestors. They were not very predisposed to look to the state of Illinois for protection. Joseph Smith, the president of the church, made a journey to Washington and pleaded with Martin Van Buren, then the President of the United States, to give some relief and protection to the Mormons who'd been driven out of Nauvoo and who were threatened. They'd been driven out of Missouri and who were threatened in Nauvoo. And Martin Van Buren famously said, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you. He was calling upon the constitutional limits on the power of the federal government. People at that time had to look to the state government, and it's easy for me to understand why the successors to Joseph Smith, my own ancestors, didn't look to the government of the state of Illinois, but looked to their ability to leave the United States. But the United States was an inadvertent helper because the United States government needed an infantry battalion to march overland from the United States to California. The Mormons were gathered at that time on the western borders of Iowa, eastern borders of Nebraska in significant numbers, and the United States sent an emissary to them offering to recruit a full battalion of infantry, later to be known as the Mormon Battalion, to march overland to Southern California, and they offered enlistment bonuses, and the poor Mormons who'd lost everything in being expelled from Nauvoo were helped by that. And Brigham Young said, please, to the men of Mormondom at that time, please enlist so that we'll have the aid that has been offered, and the Lord will bless you, and you won't have to fire a shot or suffer a single casualty. He made that prophecy. And they marched overland, still the longest U.S. infantry march in history, and they didn't have to fire a shot, and not a man lost his life. So some of the immigrants to territorial Utah came from California after the Mormon Battalion was disbanded. That's how the United States really helped the Mormons leave the United States. And then a territorial government was established in Utah, so that the Mormons didn't really get to leave the United States, though that looked like the only thing they can do after they were expelled by cannons and musket fire from Nauvoo. I think what Brigham Young did in forming a battalion of Mormons to help the United States government in their securing California was a far better exercise with the federal government than Joseph Smith's solo trip to meet a president who probably didn't have the constitutional power, as the Constitution then was, to do much for the Mormons who'd been expelled from Missouri, or to protect them much in the persecutions they were to suffer in Illinois. As I read the history of my state, the Mormon leaders made a good faith attempt to get along with those not of their faith who were arriving as merchants and as military figures and as missionaries from other Christian churches and as miners. But in the midst of that, there was a tremendous effort by the federal government to bring the Mormons into conformity with the religious values, predominantly Protestant, of the United States at that time. And so laws beginning about a decade after the Mormons arrived, laws were passed against plural marriage. Laws were passed which ultimately withdrew the ability to vote in an election from people who, not who practiced their religion, but who believed in their religion. The efforts to get along with their fellow citizens were complicated by quite a number of factors, commercial competition and a variety of different factors. But the big complicating factor and the largest impact on the free exercise of religion was the action of the federal government. The state government didn't exist. There was a territorial government of officials appointed by the United States government. And the reason they could pass laws like they did, Congress, not a local state legislature, made the laws in the territories. That decades-long controversy, but it is the same kind of controversy between the federal government in a very important interest to prevail in Utah, a territory seen in rebellion, and draconian methods were used in that, denying the right to vote to people who believed and imprisoning a lot of good people, including some of my ancestors. And on the other side were believers of that day who opposed every kind of federal law and just weren't conscious of the reality that Jesus Christ, whom we worship and whose name is in the name of our church, when faced with a question of his day, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, he took a coin and used it to teach the lesson. He said, whose image is on the coin? Caesar's. He said, therefore, render unto Caesar, that is, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and give to God the things that are God. Teaching, as I understand it, a principle that God expects us to be subject to civil authority and also to religious authority, and to learn how to make the two get along. This was finally overcome when the church president received a revelation that the church would no longer practice plural marriage. And after that was publicized, Utah succeeded in gaining statehood and began a process of learning how to live with the federal government and learning how to be a state government subject to overriding federal laws. And that's a history that's been going on for 150 years. The ascent of relations between Latter-day Saints and other citizens of the United States has been a successful ascent, really quite remarkable when you think of how few Latter-day Saints there are in the United States and how much impact they have had on the national government and the national values and laws. It would be far better if Congress at the federal level and legislatures at the state level took on these questions in a principled, overall way, rather than leaving the key guidance to the episodic actions of courts, who can only rule on the cases that come before them. And the case that comes before a court, especially the United States Supreme Court, might not be the best case to try to resolve a broad issue. It's going to speak to a narrow issue, and then you try to figure out what that means for the broader issue. And I am one who feels it would be a lot better if the elected representatives of the people, rather than the appointed, sometimes for life, judges, were to make the basic rules on this subject. I don't deny the importance of the courts. They're an essential safety net to oversee the work of the other branch of government. But I think if the public expected more of their lawmakers and relied less on and concentrated less on the judicial branch, it would be better on the whole. I think the case outlawing abortion is a good example. And I'm not saying whether I agree or disagree with that, but let's look at what happened when that was resolved by the United States Supreme Court. It was not resolved. It still is before us decades later because the court, without clear federal constitutional provisions, spoke on a right that isn't outlined in the Constitution. And that was not well accepted by many in the United States, and it still is a major source of debate in the country. And I've often wondered if it wouldn't have been better as a matter of history if the U.S. Supreme Court hadn't gotten into that so soon and had left that issue to be debated and acted upon in Congress by elected representatives and in the various states. Bear in mind, I'm not saying whether I'm for or against a particular decision. We're talking about process and which branch of government is the best branch to take on an issue in the context of the free exercise of religion. And the recent decision on same-sex marriage is another example of that. There are people on both sides of that issue, and one wonders whether that would not have been better to be threshed out by the lawmaking branch. They meet every 2 years typically, and if they go off half-cocked, the people have a chance to make their views known, and it can come up again in a subsequent session. And that is the predominant lawmaking practice in the United States. Denominational religion, people who identify with this denomination or that because they go to that church and do so regularly, that has been on the decline in the United States quite sharply, and now a minority of people are churched. Not just a minority of the whole citizenry, but a minority of people who say they believe in God and they are spiritual. But a minority of them affiliate with a particular denomination. And that is a threat to the freedom of religion, because if people don't believe in the importance of denominations, they are not likely to take very seriously the protection that free exercise provides. They will say, well, that's only of interest to people who believe that doctrine or who go to that church, because the people who believe religious doctrine and go to a church are the ones that enforce the free exercise of religion. As the number of enforcers or contenders is diminished, then the force of the guarantee is also diminished. And that is the major concern that I personally and many of my co-religionists, LDS and non-LDS, worry about, because the trend is against the seriousness with which the population as a whole regards the importance of the free exercise of religion. What I'll call the religious community needs to do a better job of saying to people who are not denominationally affiliated or don't believe in God why denominational religion is important. And here are some of the reasons for that. Number one, the denominations are the ones who line up to teach principles that benefit all of society. For example, if I'm taught by my denomination that I'm accountable to God for how I treat my fellow men, or if I'm taught that I should give to the poor, or that I should be part of charitable enterprises, which, by the way, in this country, all originated with religious motivations, whether you look at education or hospitals or care for the poor or a whole long list. The involvement of denominational religion in creating a feeling that citizens who belong to that denomination should be conferring this benefit on all of society, that's a very important reason. Also, the free exercise of religion and those who hold out for it are fundamental in helping teach their proponents and society as a whole that this is right or it's wrong. And that confers a benefit on persons whether they belong to the denomination or not. And when we look at history, we find that societies that have the free exercise of religion, allowing people to perform these functions I'm speaking of, those societies are better societies. They have a better gross national product, if you wish. They have greater peace and prosperity. They have learned how to live with one another, and the principle of a person belonging to the X church getting along with persons who belongs to the Y church, that principle laps over into parties or people of different philosophies getting together. And we look to religion for that. And for religion, the idea that somebody who's teaching me these principles teaches me that I'm accountable to God, that is a lot more forceful basis for my personal action than saying you're accountable to your party or to your philosophy or to your neighbor. We need to speak more persuasively to those who don't believe in God or to those who don't believe in churches or synagogues or mosques. We need to make a better case for the fact that whether you believe in our doctrine or not, or whether you're churched or not, we, in our activities under the free exercise of religion, benefit you in measurable ways. The laws and the cultural preferences for non-discrimination are very powerful, and some of them come right up to the free exercise of religion, some by individuals and some by denominations. And as non-discrimination gets to be more powerful feeling in the society, I see it as a major threat to the boundaries of free exercise of religion. I am very sympathetic to the importance of non-discrimination, but I'm not sympathetic to the idea that it prevails over every contest with the free exercise of religion. After all, both of them are constitutionally based, but the free exercise of religion is in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, side by side with free speech, and I think both of them are essential to a democracy and the kind of well-being that we have in our society. And I think the importance of those values needs to be remembered when they come up against non-discrimination, which is also coming to be recognized as a constitutional value, but it is not as well founded in the federal Constitution, and it is a cause for concern as a new civil right comes on the scene. Step one is for religious denominations to stop trying to oppose every non-discrimination law that opposes or infringes on some religious preference or practice. And the other side of that is for the proponents of non-discrimination to stop looking on religious doctrine and trumpeting it as a license to discriminate, and to learn how important it is to a large segment of the population to be able to practice their religion and not be caught up with a revocation of free exercise of religion by every non-discrimination law or preference. So there's education to be done on both sides, and it'll be a slow process. Doctrinally, our church teaches on the basis of revelations to the founding prophet that the United States Constitution was given to be a model for the governments of all of God's children. Not that it governs in other jurisdictions, but there are principles like popular sovereignty, the will of the people, and the honoring of religious freedom, and so on, that are models for other countries. And we preach that as we expand the doctrine of the restored church. We preach that you should be loyal to and follow the laws of your own country, but attempt to further these principles. So I think the United States Constitution is a beacon and a role model for governance and constitutional provisions for all countries in the world on a voluntary basis as they choose to use them. The idea of a Bill of Rights and the rule of law instead of the rule of men. It's not hard to look around at countries that are ruled by the preferences of dictators, not by the voice of the people. The experience of Joseph Smith in appealing to the federal government is a historic turning point, I think, in the thinking of Latter-day Saints. We can't depend on the U.S. Constitution to protect us against the kind of thing that's happening to us, and that governed decisions to try to leave the United States. What became of his effort is more to change the thinking of Latter-day Saints about federal government versus state government. But an important result of that was not his run for the presidency of the United States, which he surely could not have expected to succeed in, but it gave him a chance to make the plight of his people more visible, to float some good ideas that he had about government. And so it was, I have always looked on that as part of a proselyting effort. But we don't know why he did it, because his effort hardly got underway. It was only a few months old when he was murdered.